Hey everyone, welcome back to Rushing the Field, a college football show from NBC Sports. You can listen to us anywhere you get your podcasts. You can see us on the NBC Sports YouTube page. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. Joshua, Super Bowl in the rearview mirror, the end of football season. We actually have to watch basketball. We have a softball, baseball. We've got other stuff going on now. Although we can kind of cap it off with a Eagles win, which kind of is another national championship for Georgia. There are so many Bulldogs on that team. Their entire defense is basically the Georgia defense from a few years ago.
It's awesome. You pick winners, right? Like you go out, you draft winners, and this is what happens. Philadelphia, congratulations to them. Phenomenal. It's that old school approach, and we've seen it now in college football as well. But you got to have the trench play. Got to be great on the offensive line. Got to be great on the defensive line. Old school football is what's winning nowadays, which I love to see.
Yes, and poor Jalen Hurts is still on his post Super Bowl media blitz. I think every couple hours he pops up on a new show or in Disney World. So hopefully he gets a break at some point
Who
soon.
wouldn't want that man on their show, though? Like, think about it. Great personality, also the most handsome man playing football. Like, of course you want him on your show.
Of course. But I think he's a little tired. So hopefully he gets there. Also, big win for Alabama because you had that Devontae Smith touchdown, which was actually the first touchdown scored in a Super Bowl from a player who's drafted out of Alabama because Jalen Hurts doesn't count for that stat. Crazy. But just an incredible storyline. Bad game, blowout, of course. But the idea of Jalen Hurts and his career arc is so compelling. As people who covered him when he got benched in that national championship game, to get to see him start and win and become a Super Bowl MVP, just fantastic. So congrats to the Eagles. But with the actual end of the
jump real quick?
Yeah.
Just want quick thoughts. Did you like or dislike the halftime show, Kendrick Lamar?
So I liked it. I think that it was very cool visually as well. And I was very invested in if he was going to destroy Drake. So I was invested in all of that. I would say at my Super Bowl party, we had a couple very serious Kendrick fans who loved it. And everyone else was kind of take it or leave it.
Yeah, it's the discourse around it, I think, is interesting. I'm a Kendrick fan personally. I enjoyed it. To your point, I like the visuals. If you listen to Kendrick's music anyway, you also realize that there's always a deeper meaning to it. So if you picked up on some of the stuff going on there, but I understand the people who are like, oh, it's not a traditional halftime show where everybody feels like they can jump in. Well, that's just too damn bad, because give me more Kendrick right now.
Also loved Serena. Absolutely loved the Serena cameo. Fantastic. That was awesome. And that was one where we were all like, was that Serena Williams? And yes, it was. It was great. It was a great cap off to the football season. And now we can get in full on into NFL draft mode and all of that to come. But first, now we have, the Saints hired Kellen Moore. The head coaching carousel in the NFL is over. And therefore, it is over in college football as well. I mean, there's, knock on wood, there could always be something crazy that happens here. But we felt like it was a good time to really evaluate the coaching carousel and the cycle that we just went through. Obviously, when you try to analyze, people put grades on these hires. You have no idea. You're doing it immediately based on perceptions. And there's always guys like Scott Frost at Nebraska, coaches that seem like it's a perfect fit, like it's going to work, and then it doesn't. So with all of that said, we are going to go through the Power 4 hires one by one, and then we'll hit on, some of the group of 5 hires that we liked a lot. There were a lot more in that area of college football than in the power conferences this year. We'll get into that and other trend lines a little bit later, Joshua, but let's start with the biggest name, the GOAT, the most successful coach in NFL history, Bill Belichick. Huge stunner. Even though this was very slow moving, it took a few weeks. There were lots of reports about him meeting with North Carolina, the North Carolina brass, kind of the different factions in North Carolina leadership to decide whether or not they were actually going to go down this road and hire Bill Belichick, and how serious he was about college football. Well, it ends up happening. Still a little bit shocking every time we see photos of him out recruiting or doing his duties as the North Carolina head coach. Like, I mean, we're looking at this recruiting photo right now of him in these joggers, which, like, I know he's got a 24-year-old girlfriend right now, but I don't know if this look works for him.
It's not for him. It's not for
It's
him.
a lot of ankles. A lot of ankles.
Yes.
The suit looks a little bit better, although also looks a little overdressed when he's, going into high schools.
I mean, we're used to seeing him with like the cutoff sweatshirt, right? So like anytime he's in a suit, and he honestly looks like a schoolboy here with the khakis and the blazer on anyway, but it's a little bit jarring to like see him very formal rather than having a torn up sweatshirt on.
Yeah, and they gave him one when he got the job at the introductory press conference. So I'm like, let's just do the cutoff hoodie look for him all the way through. But I do want to talk about what we actually learned and seen and witnessed. So yes, he has gone out recruiting. That was something we wondered, right? Like you could just pop in, you're 72, you're like, other people can do this. No, he has been out, he's traveled, he's talked to recruits. Still have a lot of work to do for the recruiting class, but he's doing that. He brought in Michael Lombardi as his general manager. He brought a bunch of NFL guys in for his staff. His son, Steve Belichick, who we have spent a lot of time covering in the Big Ten last year at Washington as the defensive coordinator. He is his defensive coordinator. So there is definitely a push to be like, this is going to be run like an NFL organization. Michael Lombardi said earlier this week, everything here is predicated on building a pro team. We consider ourselves the 33rd team because everybody involved with our program has had some former aspect in pro football. North Carolina went all in. This is a $10 million a year salary for Belichick, more than doubles what Mac Brown was making. It's a play for relevance. It's a play for, hey, maybe this is the future of college football and how you manage rosters, identify talent, develop. So what ultimately, now that the dust has settled, a couple of months of this reality has existed, how do we feel about the Bill Belichick hire?
I feel all right about it. Like I always felt like this was a little bit of a strange hire from the standpoint of you went from Mac Brown, who was the oldest coach in college football, to Bill Belichick, who's like the oldest coach in college football. So from that standpoint, it didn't feel like you got yourself a longer runway to really build into something that could be dynastic. Like we've seen turnarounds in college football happen pretty quickly, but certainly doesn't feel like this is a super long-term thing that you could be doing there. For the folks who asked the question about like, is Bill going to recruit? I feel like he always had to. Like part of the reason you hire that guy is so he can walk into living rooms in high schools with all of his rings and be like, come play here. So that doesn't shock me at all. Where I think we're seeing a trend of guys who were maybe outside of some of the NFL hiring cycles having more willingness to get into college football because they see the sport heading in the direction of the NFL. I think this is obviously the biggest example, but there are other things that have happened with that. I feel like the sports are still very, very different. They're different from the way that your rosters are allocated. In the NFL, you're used to working with a legitimate cap. And out in college football, like certainly with revenue sharing, it feels like it's getting that way. But the collectives obviously have complicated things in the way that you put together your roster. In the NFL, you deal with legitimate contracts. These kids get in and out of the portal like crazy. We watched somebody transfer this year without even getting into the portal. Hear me when I say that. We watched a player go from Wisconsin to Miami without actually getting in the portal. There is not really a way to control your roster and to have players there for however long they say they're going to commit to you. And so I'm curious how all of that is going to work out from that standpoint. I'm excited to see it. Like, I think he's a very intelligent guy. I think that the way that he is planning right now is very detailed. But there are so many differences to me from what the NFL game is to what the college game is. Never mind the fact that we haven't even talked about the idea that these cats actually have to go to class, where Bill Belichick was able to keep them in the building all day long when he was a pro coach. I'm excited to watch what happens here. I think it is a good hire for everybody who says this is a home run, cannot fail. I will not get to that point, but there should be optimism here.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said about this, I think that these jobs are harder than the NFL folks think that they're going to be. Even as college football is professionalizing, I think this is going to be different and harder than Bill Belichick thought he was signing up for. And I do think he spent a lot of time, obviously, he was around Washington and his son a lot last year. So he definitely had a better sense of it than some of these other NFL coaches we've seen come into college. And they're like, oh, we're just going to do it the way that we've always done it. And it's it doesn't work. I think he seems to understand what he needs to do. The pro approach, I do think will work. And there's a lot especially in the GM role, that is going to be much more reflective of pro sports versus like in the last few years, it kind of started as like a player personnel role,
right.
and now it's definitely more related to the cap and to roster management and spending and finances. So I think that all of that stuff is really smart. But yeah, I mean, you got to report to an athletic director, a university president. You got to report to a board. You have to make sure that your kids are going to class. You need to handle when someone's got a breakup. Like there's just a lot that happens with 18 to 23-year-olds that, when it's your job and you're professional and you're, coaching Tom Brady and he's got his own system and whatever, you just don't worry about that. Now you have to worry about and now you have to think about. But it's basically like a 3-year deal. The 3 years are fully guaranteed and there's like 2 more extra years on the contract. So I think you are hoping for a shorter turnaround, which we have seen a lot in college football because of the portal. And you're thinking that, the attraction of wanting to play for Bill Belichick under his system, to see those 8 rings like that he was wearing to NFL honors, that's something you want to be around, and that can speed up the turnaround for North Carolina.
I will say this. I think there's an interesting thing that you deal with now when you're a college coach, when it comes to talent acquisition, because in the NFL, literally they had the draft, right? Like you had free agency where you had to attract guys, but certainly you'd be like Patriots dynasty want to go there, but you could draft guys. They have no choice. And I'm curious how other schools will try to negative recruit UNC, because there is a conversation about how much was Tom, how much was Bill. There's a conversation about how poorly he may or may not have drafted when he was the GM of the Patriots. There's a conversation about Mac Jones and how his best year was basically his rookie year and he regressed when he got to the NFL under Bill Belichick's tutelage. Like these are other things that he's going to have to reconcile with as well, where it's like, yeah, we feel like we're out here kind of shooting fish in a barrel because we can go and get whoever we want to, but it's real competitive out there. And people say crazy things on the recruiting trail to try to get kids to go other places. Like it is so interesting just thinking about how he handles even like that kind of minutia about how you acquire players versus the NFL, where it's just like, we recruit them in free agency, and they were really good at getting guys to take cheap deals. And I don't know if you're getting guys to take cheap deals in college. And you had the draft where you could just get whoever fell to you at your slot based off of what your board was, and that doesn't exist here either.
No, those are all great points. And again, just like what you're saying, without the structure of contracts, the length of the terms, the fact that people are locked in, the ability to go into the portal at any time and play right away somewhere else. Like these are just different dynamics. When people say that college is like free agency, it is to an extent, but there are way more rules around it in the NFL. So we'll continue to monitor that. I think it's going to give us a lot of off-season storylines. So that one is by far the most interesting of the off-season coaching moves. Let's hit on some of the other ones in the Power Four. Let's go to Purdue. So we'll stay, we'll go to the Big Ten. Barry Odom comes over from UNLV. He was 19-8 over 2 years there, which that had been such a hard place to win, which is kind of shocking considering it's Las Vegas, but they had only been to one bowl game in the previous 20 years. They believed that they could be relevant in college football. That was the pitch to him. It worked. They won 9-10 games. They were a factor in the Mountain West race. So it was incredible success for him as he became a head coach again. And then Purdue makes a change with Ryan Walters not working out, and they go with Barry Odom again, who has experience as a head coach in the SEC, and then obviously fresh off of UNLV. I like this hire. I think he is like a really, really good coach. I think he makes good hires. He had just spent some time with him when he first got to UNLV about walking into that challenge and like eyes wide open of exactly what he needed to do and how to do it. So I really like this move for Purdue. I think that Purdue is a hard job. I think a lot of that kind of tier in the Big Ten got harder when you added the 4 West Coast schools. But I like this hire. I like the experienced, and I like the way he's building his staff.
I'm totally there with you. I actually had a chance to catch up with Barry Odom right after he was hired by Purdue. And you know, we talked about the challenge of being there. And I think he understands what that is, and he's confident in his skill set because, to your point, he is a great builder, but he's also just a really good ball coach, like a good teacher, guy who knows how to recruit and develop and to get guys to go out and execute on the field. And then we talked about the other part of what makes it hard at Purdue is like, what do you do with the roster? How do you get players? And he's like, we came right in and had very hard conversations with people that were on the roster. And he's like, we know that there are guys that we want to keep here, and we'd love to be able to keep everybody here, but we got to turn this thing over as well. And so we're trying to find that balance. And so I think that's probably going to be the biggest challenge for Barry Odom, is finding the right players to fit into his system and getting those guys to want to commit to being at Purdue. We've seen this is also a place for Purdue where, you know, you might get a guy who ends up being one of the best at his position, maybe a safety or a tight end, and schools in conference might come and get him out of the portal when things happen, right? But ultimately, I really like this. I think Barry Odom is the right kind of ball coach for this spot, because he knows how to deal with being at a difficult place, a very challenging place to build. We've seen him do it before, and I think he's up to the challenge here.
Yeah, I do too. And listen, Purdue has great success at the end of the Jeff Brom era. They were in the Big Ten championship game. I think life is a little more difficult with Indiana's emergence for Purdue. I don't think that helps, and just how quick that turnaround was under Curt Cignetti. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this goes. Year one for Barry Odom. Again, he turned things around at UNLV a lot faster than even most people expected. He brought over Josh Henson from USC to be his offensive coordinator, because obviously he's more of a defensive guy. Let's go to a couple of retread hires. I guess we're learning, you can always go home, right? And one of these hires, we'll start with Rich Rodriguez of West Virginia. I don't know that there were a lot of people that thought this was ever going to be possible, because it was an ugly departure. There were a lot of hurt feelings when Rich Rod went to Michigan. And here we are. It's 2025. Rich Rodriguez is the head coach of West Virginia. It's one of the funny things when people are like, then there's reports, he's being hired, and then everyone's like, hey, let me show you what it looks like, right? And they show a photo of when he was the head coach previously, because that happened. I really like this hire for them as well, because I just think, West Virginia is in an interesting place in the current climate too, of you're in a league that now does not have Texas and Oklahoma, feels very wide open year in and year out. And Rich Rod's style of play and the way it's evolved over the course of his career, it works. I think it's going to work really well in the Big 12. It worked at Jacksonville State as they were, bumping up to FBS. Like, it's just, he's a good coach. And he did things. He won at Arizona, which is a hard place to play. Like, he's had such an interesting coaching life that I think only bodes well for West Virginia. A couple of interesting hires. Zach Alley, who had worked with him at Jacksonville State, left Oklahoma to come to West Virginia. That was a big move, and made people in Norman a little bit nervous because of what they need to do this year and the pressure on Brent Venables. And then earlier this week, he brings back Pat White, who was named the assistant quarterbacks coach, assistant to the head coach, which I also love. I love the idea of melding, hey, remember the glory days of West Virginia football? We're going to be the pieces that help bring us back to national relevance and to chase a Big 12 championship, to chase the college football playoff. So again, it's kind of unexpected. I don't think anyone would have had this on their bingo card. Certainly not back in like 08, 09. But here we are in 2025, Rich Rod back in Morgantown.
No, I mean, this is one that I love for sure. And you mentioned like bringing back some of the glory days. I think that's important. You need people who can speak to that place when it was really good. I also think having former players around is a big benefit in recruiting, because they can speak the lingo to the guys that they want to bring into the program, and they know what it takes from a player standpoint to be really successful there. The thing about Rich Rod that I think is really intriguing is, if you ask some people, the only thing they'll talk about is how bad he was at Michigan. And then you ask other people and they're like, really good first time at West Virginia, to your point, really good at Arizona. And then Jacksonville State was like phenomenal. And I think he's a good ball coach. And so again, when you have the opportunity to bring somebody in, the familiarity certainly helps, but just to bring in a good football coach, I think it makes a ton of sense there. West Virginia, I feel like in the Big 12 is in such a like weird place geographically, and that presents challenges. But I think they also like, you got the schools down in Florida who have really good proximity to great talent, but where he's at in West Virginia, like you can go and get some guys out of the Midwest that are really good and some guys up from the East Coast that are really good. And like, I think he can recruit maybe a different base with a really good player profile and build there as it was once done before.
Yeah, and I think it can have a very similar identity the way it did before. I mean, obviously Richard was at the forefront of the spread offense, which is why Michigan hired him. But it's evolved over the years. And he has stayed a step ahead of a lot of the defensive approaches to it. So I'm interested to see what that offense looks like. But like you said, the identity of the team, the way that the roster is overall, like where the guys are from, where it's made up from. And then again, how it competes and matches up against some of the other styles in the Big 12. So let's stay in the Big 12 with another school that brought back a coach to bring back the glory days, and that's UCF bringing back Scott Frost. National champion Scott Frost. I think they still have it up in the stadium from 2017. So Scott Frost has been out of coaching since he left Nebraska. I think was he like an analyst in the NFL
with
a little
Rams.
bit?
Yeah, I think he Rams. Was like in the background.
I think he took a year off and then did that or whatever it was, but he's kind of out of sight, out of mind. Comes back, UCF again, another one where it's like, let's post a photo of what Scott Frost looks like in UCF gear. And he's back. Now it's a little bit different, right? Like he is now, like they were kind of one of the poster children for the expanded playoff. Right. And for the idea that like the best group of 5 teams deserved a shot at this. Now UCF is bumped up. They're in the Big 12, a new look Big 12. But that creates a different path, that there is a path to the playoff for UCF. They don't have to go perfect back-to-back years and still be told they're not good enough. So it's a different world that Scott Frost is walking into, even though it's a familiar place that obviously is welcoming him. He talked a lot about, we hear this from coaches all the time, this idea of like, don't mess with happy. And, you're so focused on climbing and climbing and climbing, that he wishes he hadn't, right? He wishes he had stayed at UCF, which I think is, of course, what you're going to say when you come back to some place that wants you back, that you had a lot of success at. But I think that's going to be very interesting and perhaps instructive as how he handles, this program build, the second go around. One hire that I loved was Mackenzie Milton as quarterbacks coach. Again, like everyone's just like going back to the well. If we're going to go back to the good times with this head coach, let's go back and bring some of the key players back here as well. So this one's going to be really interesting. I think it's going to work to a level of success because he does understand the place. But it's just like, this was something that I did not expect. And you just had the previous head coach who people thought was going to work, Gus Malzahn, who left to go become the offensive coordinator at a different program. So like, there's just so many layers to this one, that I'm fascinated to watch how this goes for Scott Frost 2.0.
No, it is fascinating. The comment that you brought up that he made about coming back is so intriguing, because I think the reality of the situation is he was never not going to leave for Nebraska as a place he had history with. And when you were at UCF at the time, Nebraska is in a much better position resource-wise, the ability to pay you and to pay a staff that you would take that job. Coming back to UCF now, where they're positioned as a P4 school, like I think it's a great opportunity for him. He already had success there, as you mentioned. The biggest question is, what did he learn from his time at Nebraska? Because things got sideways with him dealing with players and building the roster, but also with the coaching staff. And he has to have that internal conversation of, okay, there are things that I did well before that made me successful. There are also things that I can't do when I come back here that I did before. And so I think as long as he has that conversation, to your point, I don't know what degree is going to work to, but it'll certainly work. I think this is where we realize that this dude can coach ball. He can build a program. He can have them competitive with some of the best in the country. And UCF, frankly, is in a better spot now than they were before to be able to do all those things.
Yeah. And again, being in Orlando in this era of college football should be great for them. They should be able to get great players. They should be a place that people want to maybe transfer back to if it didn't work somewhere else. So we'll see. Scott Frost did bring over a couple of the assistants that he had with him in Nebraska. You remember he brought the entire staff from UCF to Nebraska, which was also part of like, hey, maybe that wasn't the best idea. Like maybe you need to do some things differently. But there will be, obviously that familiarity on that staff with him, and then some newer pieces. Going to be very, very interesting to watch. The last Power 4 hire that we're going to hit on here is Wake Forest. Now, Wake Forest goes and hires Jake Dickert, who is a head coach at Washington State. He had been promoted internally. He was the DC and got the job after Nick Rolovich was let go. I like this hire a lot. I think Jake Dickert really seems like a very like a good football coach. He's got his players back. They're a very like kind of clear identity, tough team. But the bigger thing that I wanted to hit on with this hire was there were a lot of Wazoo fans very upset. Just like there were Oregon State fans upset when Jonathan Smith left for Michigan State. This one, I think even more so because it's not, like in the Big Ten or the SEC. Wake Forest probably isn't the football team that you would say is like a perennial power in the ACC or anything like that. And I think in a different world, it's viewed as a lateral move. But to me, this is just like, okay, guys, I know we want to make the Pac-12 exist. And you're keeping the name and you're trying to invest at a power level, but it's not, right? This is like a group of 5 conference and level. And that's why these coaches are leaving for other opportunities. But I like the fit at Wake Forest. I think that that's a tough place to be, and to coach. And we certainly heard from that for Dave Clawson, who was there for a long time. The Sam Hartman years, they had some real success, but it kind of dropped off. And you have academic requirements, again, like a conference that is very split on like, hey, are we investing in football? Are we a basketball league that we're trying to like recapture our basketball glory? It's a very difficult spot to be in for Wake Forest. But I do think in a revenue share world, I think that helps with some of those schools that maybe can't NIL fundraise millions and millions every single year. But the school can certainly devote, X dollars to its football team. That will hopefully even the playing field a little bit. But I like the hire, and I just think it says something larger about kind of like the state of the new Pac-12.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about like the NIL fundraising as well for a school like Wake Forest in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I lived there as a little kid. Their biggest source of industry is not something you can really leverage for NIL. I don't think people want big tobacco dollars running through the universities like that. So it's certainly a strange spot. You mentioned academic overlays. The ACC as a conference as well, to your point, it's stabilized, but it feels like there is consternation that's still around that conference. But when you're Jake Dickert, you're thinking about what's the best move for my career. And even though this, reemergence of the Pac-12 is something that people are putting a lot of momentum behind and want to happen, I don't think you can risk hanging out somewhere where you don't think there's stability, where you can't accurately, picture the future.
But I also think that it's like they're trying to, or at least kind of, again, reframing, but like they want to be the premier group of 5 league, like, right. They want to be like their champion gets in over the Mountain West, over the American, like that's right. A different world. That's not equivalent to being in the ACC.
Yes. I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at is like, but you don't even know if that can happen, regardless of that, right. Whether that's what they want to do or not. Like, I can't sit here with my career and say, I'm going to just believe everything that you're telling me and hope that it works out that way. Because if you're the top G5 conference, it's like, it's a good spot to be. I'm not trying to disrespect any of that, but it's this whole idea of the unknown, and I've got to make the best move for myself.
Agree. So yeah, those are the P4 hires. There were a ton of moves and changes in the group of 5. We're not going to go through all of them. But I did want to see if there were a couple that jumped out to you, Joshua, as hires you really liked. We had a couple FCS hires or former FCS head coaches get FBS jobs. You saw, Bronco Mendenhall move to from New Mexico to Utah State. I'm interested in that. But Matt Entz is someone who is the former North Dakota State head coach. He's at Fresno now. Zach Kitley. He's been a rising star for a while, was a Texas Tech OC. He's now the head coach at FAU. Dan Mullen trades out his seat in the booth to become the head coach at UNLV. Anything that jump out to you out of the G5 hires?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few of them. I would start with Dan Mullen and UNLV. Now that it's been elevated, I think he takes that job over with momentum.
Yep.
For all the folks that I have talked to about Dan Mullen, and obviously my orbit playing for Urban Meyer crosses over with his a ton. Super sharp guy, like very, very smart guy. The roster building and the recruiting and everything was just like not his thing. And I think to his benefit, when you're at UNLV, you got some younger, hungry coaches that are on your staff. Like those guys are going to be out there and they're going to be recruiting hard. And so I think he can actually put together something pretty solid there. So I'm excited about that. Joe Harasimiak was actually one of my favorite coordinators in the Big Ten to watch. I always thought that he had put together really good defenses. So I'm excited to see what he could do at UMass, not a place that's traditionally known for having a ton of success, but I think he'd be able to stand up to the challenge there. So certainly excited about those two. And then finally, Matt Entz, again, Fresno State, a place where team coaches have been able to have success. Programs have been able to build there. And he is a guy who has built, and he's a guy who has had success. And so I think it's a really good fit for him.
Yeah, last one I'll just mention is Willie Simmons. So he is the head coach at FIU. He was the Florida A&M head coach and wasn't good at getting looks, for other jobs. It's really hard to, I did a story on the basketball side a few years back about working at HBCUs and just trying to like get consideration, even for like what would be like a lateral job move. And it's really hard because you get labeled and you get kind of in a certain track. So he goes and becomes a position coach, the running backs coach at Duke, and then gets this FIU opportunity. So interested to see how that works out for him as well. Joshua, as we look like broader at this hiring cycle, again, by far way more moves in the group of 5 than in the Power 4. There was actually some coaches that were very high profile, very big hot seats that were retained. They did enough to keep their jobs. And also there was expensive buyouts. So Billy Napier stays at Florida. Dave Aranda stays at Baylor. Mike Gunny stays at Oklahoma State, although that got pretty contentious and he had to take a pay cut. That got a little sideways. Sam Pittman stays at Arkansas. And even Trent Dilfer stays at UAB, even though that's been a complete disaster. So what do you make broadly about that? That we're heading into this revenue share era where these schools, these power conference schools, are going to be spending, maybe there's a new $20 million line item for paying players directly, and there's not that much movement in the power conferences.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, right? You look at athletic departments and you look at TV contracts and you see the money that's coming in, and it would be like a person who is a high income earner, right? Like money's just coming in. But then on the other side, you have all of these expenses of what it takes to run an athletic department. And so when it's time to make changes, it'd be like if you made a lot of money, but you maybe, overextended yourself. And it's like, I want to get a new car, but I'm upside down on the current car. I can't sell it right now. I got to wait and write it out and maybe see if I can get into a better position to where it makes sense to get rid of it down the line. I think that's kind of what we have seen with some of these P4 schools is like, do I want to make a change? Yeah, maybe I want to make a change, but is that the best thing for us to do with some of the expenses that we have right now? So I do think it makes a lot of sense. Like, I think some of these coaches should feel a little bit thankful for the new world that we're in, because it's giving athletic departments the opportunity to be more patient, or maybe forcing them to be more patient, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I know this isn't exactly about the question you asked. Billy Napier, have you seen Florida's upcoming schedule? It's basically the same thing they had last year. Like, Florida's getting hosed right now. Like, I hope everything works out, because they were really fun to watch when they were playing well this year, but their schedule is doing them no favors for next year.
No, but they still have DJ Lagway, and which I assume was a big part about retaining him, right? Where he was immediately like, yes, that's my guy. I'm obviously staying. But I think that, to your point, it's not just even the line item, like the extra expense, but also, don't you have enough smart people around you saying, hey, maybe we should, instead of having dead money and a buyout, why don't we invest in NIL deals, in the rev share piece of this? Like, why not put the money where the talent is and see if that makes a difference? And I think that's really smart. And we're seeing that in a lot of different ways. We're seeing it not work in some ways, but then you could, like, so Indiana basketball, they spent a lot of money, got key players, big time transfers. It didn't work. Mike Woodson's out at the end of the year. But at least if you're Indiana, you can be like, hey, we tried. We did everything. We pushed
figured
all
out that the coach was actually the problem.
and the coach was the problem, right? You're like, you're crossing everything else off the list. So again, so you have a couple different elements. Like one, it's just, you should be spending the money on trying to get the best talent in supporting the players, but also, yes, like then you can kind of weed out what is the issue. Is it a resource problem? What needs to change for success? So that's part of this. And then I just think in general, the group of 5 programs, they're not going to be spending as much in the rev share. Their NIL isn't the same level in a lot of places. So I think there's still just more of the usual dynamics in a coaching change of like, it's not working. These buyouts are not like $20 million. Like we need to ignite our fan base. We need season ticket renewals. We need this, this, and this. And so I think you just saw, the normal level of impatience in a lot of these places. And, again, a couple years into a realigned world where different conferences and different schools have maybe different expectations. So people are making moves. But I think it's just a totally different world without talking about the size of the buyouts and the rev share component of this not looking the same.
Yeah, I will say this about the G5 ranks, and I think we've seen a little bit of it, and I'm curious if it happens more, is a lot of times it would be you go from being a coordinator at a big school to being a head coach at the G5 school, and then you move up to being a head coach at, wherever else, right? Like you just kind of keep going up the ladder. It feels like right now we might be in a place where you're the head coach at the G5 school and you end up taking the coordinator job at the P4 school because you get more money in a lot of instances doing that. The way some of these coordinators are getting paid right now, it's absolutely ridiculous. But you also get to coach ball and you're not worried about all of the other things that go along with it. So, down the line, as we start to settle into this new world, I'm curious how that impacts G5, just from their ability to retain really good head coaches that might just be looking for an exit door for more money, maybe a little bit more face time at a bigger school, or just to not have to deal with all of the crazy chaos and not getting paid the $8 million other coaches are getting paid to do.
We saw a good amount of that last cycle, heading into the 2024 season with multiple coaches like Mo Lindquist and other people leaving, maybe getting out ahead of hot seats. But some just voluntarily leaving to become coordinators or position coaches elsewhere. And then I think too, and I mentioned Willie Simmons as another example of someone doing that. In this cycle, you did have head coaches like Gus Malzahn decide to be coordinators at different programs as well. So you have some of that. But I also think we're seeing, at least at the G5 hires, there were a number of hires of like FCS coaches, like lower level coaches, head coaches with track records being bumped up instead of like the hotshot coordinators, the assistants. And some of that is salary based, right? If you're making a lot more money as a coordinator in the SEC, you're not going to take one of those jobs. But I think also, like, we talked about this so much with Kurt Cignetti. We've talked about it with Lance Leipold, Chris Kleiman. Like, there are some really, really good coaches that win with way less resources than you would have in FBS. And so maybe people were looking at that a little bit differently, as well as like financially that bump up made a lot more sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole finance thing is really interesting. Like you got position coaches at some of these big schools that are making 800, 900,000, $1 million a year, right? And so like I could understand where you say that you would have to look down a level in competition, and you could probably find yourself a steadier, more known commodity, ready to be a head coach than trying to go after one of the hot shot names that you see at one of these bigger schools. So pipelines start to change a little bit, but ultimately you might end up doing yourself a favor because you get a guy who's done the job before. Yeah.
And again, with less, like you can win with less, you should be able to win with more and better talent and more money behind you. The last trend I want to talk about is the NFL to college pipeline. Wasn't that long ago where all the NFL folks were like, oh my gosh, everyone hates college football. Everyone's leaving. There's a mass exodus of all the talent. I mean, it was literally this time last year that was happening when Jeff Hafley like jumped to restart the clock and left BC to work for the Packers. Now there's been like huge numbers going the other direction. You mentioned it off the top, right? Of the college football is becoming more professionalized. There are more roles that look like roles in the NFL. It's still different, still entirely different product and different system, but it's not just Bill Belichick. I mean, we've seen different coordinators, a lot of defensive coordinator hires from the NFL, including your Buckeyes, who just brought Matt Patricia in as their defensive coordinator. But we saw Andrew Luck take a GM role at Stanford, Ron Rivera take a GM-ish role at Cal. There are a lot of big NFL names who want to get into college football right now. And I'm just curious about why you think that's happening. Why was there so much? Did Bill Belichick doing it open up some eyes to opportunities that could be there? Do people just really want to help their alma mater? Like, is there just like an altruistic piece of this of like, hey, I'm at the point in my life where I can, make a decision like this and go spend some time helping Stanford or Cal?
I think there's a little bit of that, right? Like, I think all of us who, there's that attraction. Like, you love your alma mater, I love my alma mater, right? Like, if the right opportunity opens up for some of these people, I think they're like 100% I would do it. I also think this is a really exciting time for some of these people to get into college football and to do a role that maybe hasn't been done, and to be on the cutting edge of maybe changing the way that the sport looks and how people manage it. I think that's a part of their motivation as well. When I look at some of the coaches, though, I think some of these coaches had honest conversations with themselves, and they were like, I ain't getting the looks in the NFL right now. Like, there's the job that I want isn't there. And I think that in college football, they would respect my knowledge. They would respect what I could bring to the table. And this is an opportunity for me to get back into coaching. I look at Bill Belichick, and he had one interview with the Falcons last year, and I think that reset him, where it's like, man, maybe my stock wasn't as high as I thought it would be. And going to college football might not be a bad thing, especially if they're paying him $10 million a year. No idea what Matt Patricia is going to get paid, but after the way things happened with Detroit, and then the time that he spent in Philly where he had to take over play calling and it didn't go very well, he's going to be making a lot of money at a place that wants him to be there right now. And if he does a great job with Ohio State's defense, which he's going to have plenty of talent, some of these guys haven't played very much, plenty of talent, who knows how hot his name might be in the next cycle or two in the NFL. And so I really do think these guys are looking at it maybe not as like such a step down in competition and like, the kids table. I think they're looking at it as a real opportunity to coach guys who are very good players, to make a ton of money doing it, and then to get back to what they ultimately wanted to do, which is coaching in general, but maybe coaching back in the NFL in a year or two.
Yeah, I would love for, again, this is what bothered me a year ago of these narratives from NFL folks that like, people want it out of college. It's too hard. It's too annoying. Was kind of like what you just said about this, like the kids table. Like, it's not even like the highest level of football. They're different sports. There's a ton of overlap, right? And a bunch of the best players go directly from one to the other. But like, there are great, great coaches. Like, no one thinks like Nick Saban's not a great coach because he did it in college. And so I would love some of this like back and forth to just kind of get rid of some of those stereotypes or narratives about these jobs. And there's always a lot of movement with assistants every single year. We just don't usually talk about it as much. But I think that's important. I also think back to something Jed Fish told me last spring when we were talking about his staff, which obviously also had a lot of NFL names and sons of offspring. And he had Steve Belichick coordinating his defense. And his thing was, hey, we studied all the best defenses in college football. They all were NFL defenses. Like, they were run by guys that had NFL experience. And I think that is absolutely clearly a trend line in where some of these hires are. I mean, we talked about Ohio State. I mean, Michigan did this last year, bringing in Wink Martindale. There's a lot of different places that are looking for that element, and they just think that is the way to run a defense in the modern era of college football. So I think that's an interesting piece as well. If you look at trend lines like that and then decide, hey, we want to get in on that.
No, I'm totally there with you. And to that point, like, I think players have kind of forced that as well. I think a lot of times, especially transfer players, they ask the question when they sit down with the coordinators, like, how does playing in your system translate to me going to the NFL? And one of the answers can be, well, you're going to put up a ton of stats, so you're going to look really good. Or the other answer can be, this is what they run in the league. And so if you come here, you're going to be running very similar concepts to what you see at the next level. And so I think it's kind of like this feedback loop of players want to play in those defenses, and coaches are now realizing some of the best defenses, because they've got great players, are those exact defenses. The other thing that I think is interesting when it comes to these guys getting into the college game, we asked the question about, like, will Bill Belichick recruit? And he has to, right? Like, that's a part of the allure here. I don't know if Matt Patricia is going to be recruiting and some of these other guys, But with the size of these staffs and the recruiting departments that they don't have, he doesn't have to do a damn thing. He might have to go out and close a couple times, but he's not going to be on the jet the same amount of time.
Deion Sanders doesn't. Deion Sanders doesn't go anywhere.
I mean, that's the thing about it. Like you look at the way that staffs are built right now. You have guys that are like legit recruiters, like recruiters on the staff. And then you got other guys who are like the mad scientist dude, and they all play their position. So I think this whole question about like, well, is he a good recruiter? I don't think it's as big of a deal anymore because of how these staffs are built and developed. And also just the sheer size of these recruiting departments nowadays. You can just go get you a ball coach if you need one.
Agree. And also like they've changed the rules around who can actually do on-field instruction. Everything is loosened now. So you can have more guys that can do more things. Plus you have financial relations. Like you don't have to just sell them on you as a person. You can sell them on, this is what we run. This is how I coach you. And this is what you're paid. Like it's just a different decision-making process now. Which again, I think is probably also enticing for some of these guys who want to come and do different things. It's more transactional. It's more like the NFL because it's not, again, we're moving more towards contracts, but it's not quite the same yet, but it's just different. It's not, maybe you're not going to have to call 17-year-olds all the time. Maybe you only have to do it like a little bit and that's tolerable.
I mean, I'll tell you this story. So Urban, after practice, he would have like, I sold real estate at one point, and if you went into the office, there would be like dial time where you would get on the phone and you would cold call people. And Urban basically had that for his coaches. And he would make them log how many calls they made and what the context of the call was and how the conversation went. And I don't think in that world you get the Bill Belichicks and the Matt Patricias and some of these other NFL names that have a desire to coach college football. But they're not, it's just not the same anymore. Like it is a very different world in terms of this sport that we're living in right now.
It is. And talent evaluation is totally different as well with so much film and access to information. It's going to be a fascinating first year for a lot of these guys. And no one more interesting than Bill Belichick at North Carolina. We will continue to follow all of these offseason storylines, but those are our initial thoughts on the cycle. I think we liked a lot of these hires. Going to be really interested to see how they go. And then also with some of the coaches that were retained, how their seasons go, as well as buyouts drop a little bit as well. But yeah, we're going to have a ton of offseason content here on Rushing the Field. We're going to bring in some of our friends. We're going to bring in coaches, players, lots of folks to talk to. But this was our Coaching Carousel recap as we are finally at the end of the football season for 2024-2025. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. This is Rushing the Field, and we'll be back soon.